This presentation is part of the academic webinar series of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. To view a full catalog of our past presentations and for a schedule of our upcoming webinars, please visit nonviolent-conflict.org and click on the Learning and Resources tab. Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Jake Fitzpatrick, and I'm the Content Development Associate at ICNC. And today's webinar is titled Recovering Nonviolent History, Civil Resistance and Liberation Struggles, and will be delivered by my colleague, Dr. Maciej Bartkowski. Dr. Maciej Bartkowski is the Senior Director for Education and Research at ICNC and works on academic and online programs for students, faculty, and educators, curricular development, global academic and educational outreach, and research in the growing field of civil resistance studies. He has taught short seminars and spoke about strategic nonviolent conflict, movements mobilization, nonviolent actions, civil resistance and democratic transitions at various academic institutions and policy forums around the world, among others, the Council of Europe, Community of Democracies, Amsterdam University, University of Basque Country, Cambridge University, Rosario University in Colombia, Hong Kong University, Cairo University, United Nations Peace University in Costa Rica, Peace Research Institute in Norway, and Uppsala University in Sweden. Dr. Bartkowski conducts research and writes on nonviolent movements and strategic nonviolent conflict. His co-authored articles on civil resistance include A Human Right to Resist and Egypt, How to Negotiate the Transition, Lessons from Poland and China. His recently published edited book is titled Recovering Nonviolent History, Civil Resistance and Liberation Struggles and Nation-Making, and you can find more information on that book at recoveringnonviolenthistory.org. And together with Dr. Howard Burrell, an ICNC academic advisor, he is completing a paper on space and a leverage multiplier effect in civil resistance struggles. Dr. Bartkowski also holds a position of an adjunct professor at George Mason University, where he teaches a course on civil resistance. He will also teach a course on strategic nonviolent conflict at Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, Johns Hopkins University, this upcoming fall 2013. Before joining ICNC, Dr. Bartkowski has worked as a lecturer, a visiting faculty, and a director of academic programs at a number of academic institutions in the U.S., Central and Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. He has taught at the Bard College Globalization and International Affairs Program in New York, the Open Society Institute Undergraduate Exchange Program, at Delphi University, and at the Academy of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He holds a PhD in political science and an MA in international relations and European studies from Central European University in Budapest, and completed his undergraduate work at the American University of Central Asia in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. With that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Bartkowski.
Thank you, Jake, very much for this introduction. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the time zone that you are joining us from. My presentation will be about the content of the book, of the recently published edited volume, Recovering Nonviolent History, Civil Resistance and Liberation Struggles. But of course, given the time frame, I will not be able to talk about all the ideas and concepts included in that book. So I can only refer you to the website of the book, www.recoveringnonviolenthistory.org, where you can find quite, I think, detailed descriptions of the content of the book, and if you are interested, get hold on a copy of that book. So I will first talk about what is civil resistance to kind of lay out the groundwork for our discussion. I will also refer to how civil resistance works and speak in details about why I think the civil resistance has been largely forgotten, and then eventually we'll talk about the impact of civil resistance as it transpires from the edited volume. My general definition of civil resistance is sustained nonviolent organizing and contestation led by ordinary people against oppression. And civil resistance is applicable not only to conflicts that involves the repressive state, but it could be repressive non-state violent actors. It could be, for example, also corporations. And there are a couple of, I think, important ideas that are included in that very general definition, which, first of all, is the conflict that is essentially based on a perfect asymmetry between people that are completely unarmed and challenging a fully armed opponent and usually very resourceful opponent. And of course that actually creates a very interesting puzzle. How come that given this disproportionality of force, the ordinary people are still being able to effectively challenge their adversaries? And we've got so many examples to refer to, and that creates an interesting puzzle to investigate. It is also an unconventional contestation, and this is the contestation that is based on political action, not on the physical response. This means that people are organizing against around certain ideas, ideas that represent people's grievances, that represent the causes that inspire people. People join civil resistance voluntarily, not because they are forced or because they are paid. So oftentimes people refer to civil resistance as the battle for ideas, and who better presents those ideas and have greater appeal to the people, he is able to win that legitimacy contestation. And as I said, this is the political struggle, not a physical one. And finally, it's based, this contestation, this resistance or defiance is based on the various types of nonviolent methods. And there are different categorization of nonviolent methods. The basic one is that people can use various types of disruptive methods as well as constructive ones. The disruptive ones would be based on protest demonstrations, on various types of non-cooperation measures, strikes, boycotts. But also, on the other hand, while engaging in this disruptive resistance, or even maybe prior to this, people are also oftentimes pursuing more constructive type of resistance by building parallel or alternative institutional structures in support of the later, perhaps direct actions. So, what was the beginning of the book? And the inspiration for the book was actually the talk given by Obama in Cairo University in June 2009. Perhaps without that talk, the book might not have seen the daylight. And in that speech, Obama talked about the futility of violence while referring to the struggle for Palestinian statehood and providing examples about nonviolent resistance from United States civil rights movement, anti-apartheid struggle, a number of struggles from Central Europe and from Southeast Asia as kind of beacons of nonviolent struggles that were successful. And after that talk, a number of people actually criticized Obama, saying that there was kind of a contradiction between his call for the use of nonviolent resistance in the struggles for statehood and U.S. kind of path to independence, which they said that it was violence through violence against the British, and that time I thought that this was a misconception, as there are so many misconceptions about civil resistance. It was one of them. which was really more associated with the ignorance of history and ignorance of what is nonviolent conflict, simply because one can argue, and that's what a chapter by Walter Conser, who wrote about nonviolent resistance by American colonists against the British, argues, is that military struggle of 75 and 81 in the United States was not really a real revolution. That revolution happened during the 10 years of nonviolent resistance that took place prior to the outbreak of hostilities, violent hostilities between Americans and the British. And so the inspiration was the fact that there was not really much understanding, and still there is not much understanding about the place and the role of nonviolent conflict, nonviolent resistance or civil resistance in the history of nation-making, in the history of nation-states. And that was the kind of the beginning of the book itself. Before I talk about the content of the book, I wanted to first clarify the issue of political power and agency, which is very much it's very important concept for the book itself. Of course, when we talk about political power, we usually would think about the kind of the top leadership that is holding that power. Usually that power is centralized, is fixed, it's permanent, and if the change occurs in that power, that change comes from top rather than from the bottom up, and it's usually the elites that would decide if and what kind of change they would like to introduce. So there is a lot of emphasis on permanency and resilience of those in power, and a number of regional experts that are right now trying to explain why they failed to predict the Arab Spring would emphasize this issue that they have written so much about the resilience of authoritarian rulers precisely because they look at the positions, at the structures, at the political power at the top, that they essentially failed to see the change coming from the bottom up, the change that would be pushed through nonviolent organizing, simply because of the emphasis on the resilience of the authoritarian regimes. And in fact, the real power, according to the premises of the civil resistance studies, lies not in the center, but lies in the agency of ordinary people. Political theorists actually observe that rulers derive their political power from consent. They would usually talk about social contract. However, few, if any, realized and acknowledged that explicitly until the publication by Gene Sharp in 1973, that if large number of people deliberately and in an organized fashion withdraw peacefully, non-violently, they consent to be governed, this could actually redefine political power. And revolutions are only most, I think, visible manifestations, as Hannah Arendt said, of where a true power has been lying all along, and that power is with the people. And this is the power of obedience and disobedience to laws, to rules, to institutions. Simply, no dictator can rule without obedience or acquiescence of at least part of the society, and that's where that power is really based. So civil resistance is in that sense about agency of ordinary people, and there was really not much perspective of civil resistance understood as this agency of ordinary people included in the analysis of the formation of independent nation states. Usually the prevailing interpretation regarding the studies of the nation states formation is based on those three accounts of three perspectives that I identified: the kind of more violent perspective, the macro level perspective of structural changes in society and economy, and then the kind of more top-down perspective of what the elites were deciding and doing. And there was really not much focus on the role and impact of nonviolent civil resistance via the perspective of organized collective of people. That's what we were trying to bring in our book, and it's interesting to see by trying to explain, I think, why oftentimes there was a lack of that perspective, or not much visible in the context of civil resistance in the independence struggles. The interpretation that people were seen as victims, that was oftentimes a prevailing one, and if subjugated and colonized peoples or nations are seen as victims, then they are by definition supine or weak. And oftentimes people themselves who are living under the foreign yoke saw themselves as victims, victims of more powerful neighbors. But my argument is, and oftentimes that's what has happened when the civil resistance emerges, is that victims are in fact dormant power holders. And the question is, I think, how those seemingly powerless victims can in fact become action takers. And oftentimes that takes place through a kind of cognitive, to use the McAdam term, cognitive liberation. There is a cognitive shift in people's thinking, in people's mind, that essentially their own behavior, oftentimes their own inaction, contributes to the durability of the oppressive system. And I just identify a couple of quotes that some of them are in the book, some of them are kind of new ones that are indicative of how some activists or thinkers or kind of move beyond the kind of understanding ourselves as victims to understanding that our behavior as victims contribute to the existence of the oppression. And you can read that yourself. And the next phase of this cognitive shift is that if our behavior contributes to the existence of the oppression, then in fact we are the drivers of the change. We can be the drivers of the change because if we adjust our behavior, if we organize ourselves, if we become disciplined in what we do, we can be actually our own liberators. And this oftentimes comes out in the analysis of the emergence of civil resistance, this kind of shift from the understanding that we are part of the problem to then another understanding that if we are part of the problem, we could be also part of the solution. The cases that are included in the book, they were actually selected quite carefully. A number of them, they have never been written about from the context of civil resistance. They include examples of cases of nonviolent resistance that are culturally diverse, culturally, politically, socially diverse, and they come from different geographical and historical regions. And there are, all in all, there are 15 cases included of secessionist or independence struggles where a number of nonviolent campaigns and episodes of civil resistance have been identified. And this goes beyond the book itself. I did a kind of calculation on the number of nonviolent struggles that we currently identify, combining the 15 cases included in the book and then also the cases from the NAVCO dataset, which is nonviolent and violent campaigns and outcomes, that was developed by my colleague Erika Chenoweth. and also struggles that happened recently, and they are the struggles against dictatorship, for self-determination, and against occupation. And we see the increasing trend of the occurrence of nonviolent resistance struggles in those conflicts. Actually, when we just look at the last 10 years of this century and compare that with the last 50 years of the previous century, there is almost like a 4 times growth, 4 times more frequently we see the presence of nonviolent resistance struggles nowadays than it was just 2 or 3 decades ago, and that trend seems to be on the rise. And we can, in the Q&A, we can talk about the reasons, I think, for the increase in the use of civil resistance by ordinary people against a very brutal regimes. When I'm in the classroom, I would usually ask my students to tell me what is the first thought that comes to their mind when they see those places, the names of those places. And given the nature of our talk, I will have to answer that myself. And of course, those places, as you probably rightly guessed, they refer to the locations where the peace treaties were signed. Another slide with the same question is about the terms. And usually my students, the first reaction would be, their response would be that those terms are associated with violence. And it's true that we hear much more from the books we read, from the media we watch, about the episodes of important episodes where the peace treaties were signed, or actually episodes of spectacular and dramatic violence, and not often we hear about civil resistance. And that brings me to another part of the presentation about why exactly, in comparison with peace efforts or violent conflicts, we don't hear so much about civil resistance, despite the fact that civil resistance, as recent events even showed, plays such an important role in driving important political changes around the world. So in my view, there are 3 major what I call denials of civil resistance. First one is that people would think that civil resistance was really not part of important historical processes, and they would then talk about elites, they would talk about structural changes, they would talk about violent conflicts, and also that civil resistance is not really a legitimate means of political action, and it's not effective tool for waging political action. And I will focus briefly on each of those denials. So the first one about the existence. As I mentioned, the focus of the conversation in the mainstream media, even in serious journal articles and books, it's on institutions, on leaders, on norms that drive political change. If we focus just on human rights field, that is dominated by legal scholars and legal literature, there is really not much writing done on the origin of human rights from the perspective of civil resistance. If one analyzes, for example, labor rights, children's rights, women's rights, indigenous people's rights, it's difficult to understand the evolution of those rights, the trajectories of how they eventually evolve, and the content of those rights without reference to the organizing of by ordinary people using nonviolent methods to win those rights in the first place. Oftentimes the courts only later were issuing the interpretations and the verdicts under the pressure of the popular-based mobilization. The same thing is about democratic transitions. When we read about the transitionology literature, there is a lot about structural changes, about establishing free and fair electoral infrastructure, independent media, establishing the Montesquieu division of power between executive and legislative, establishing civilian control over the military, but there is really not much understanding about the role of organized citizenry, of organized people using nonviolent collective methods in pushing for democratization and in leading actually the transition. And the same thing with corruption. My colleague Shaska Bayerle, her new book on civil resistance against corruption will be published this year by Lynn Reiner. So we will be filling in an important, I think, gap in the understanding of what civilians are doing and through the non-violent campaigns in leading anti-corruption struggles. Usually, in the context of corruption, one would talk more about the laws, about the sunshine laws introduced by the parliament, about the enforcement institutions, about what parliamentarians, what elites are doing in terms of fighting corruption, rather than what ordinary citizens can do. And then some people would say that, or the denial of existence would be connected with the argument that which is correct, that civil resistance doesn't or didn't leave much historical record. And this picture comes from Syria in 2011 when the resistance was still largely non-violent. And this is the picture of the fountain. Hundreds of fountains around Syria have been dyed in color red to represent the blood of the non-violent activists in a kind of more visible defiance of the Assad regime, a very symbolic type of defiance. Now, if that happened 100 years ago, the historians would likely not even register this type of resistance. So oftentimes when one writes about the history of civil resistance struggles in independence, during the independence struggles, then one has problems even finding the examples of nonviolent actions, not because they haven't existed, but because they haven't been even registered that time as being anything significant. And oftentimes our collective memory is really determined by the discourse about the violent victimhood, about oftentimes glorified violent resistance. If one looks at the commemorative landscape of your own countries, and today's audience is really very diverse, very international and global. So if you just analyze what kind of holidays, national holidays are present in your country, you realize that those national holidays are celebrations of heroes that fallen violently, fighting for the freedom of your nations. Oftentimes the celebrations that end a violent conflict or celebrate signing of peace treaties. There is not really much and many national holidays that would celebrate the actions of nonviolent resistors. They do exist, but they are in minority in comparison with celebrations, anniversaries, and commemorations of something that is connected with violence. And of course, if we talk about the struggle, if we talk about the conflict, we would always tend to associate that with violence, with violent conflict, rather than with non-violent resistance. And you know, in fact, in the book, we show that what was described as impressive, unprecedented collective nonviolent actions were then subsequently abandoned by the people in favor of violent struggle. And that shift oftentimes jeopardized mobilization of people, solidarity, and economic and social progress that has been achieved during this nonviolent resistance phase, and oftentimes jeopardize what was created in terms of autonomous civil or political society. And this is the list of cases where the population engaged in civil resistance only then to abandon it in favor of armed struggle. And that's actually, interestingly enough, that also happened recently in Syria. And the response or the explanation provided in one of the chapters, the chapter on United States, the author writes, many American colonists didn't realize what had been accomplished or understood what they had achieved by this point. They didn't understand what could have been further achieved if they had continued using nonviolent resistance. And I think it's a very insightful comment, particularly if I right now look at Syria. The largely or only or purely nonviolent resistance that took place between March and August 2011 in Syria. I cannot find a very thorough analysis of what has been accomplished during that time in the first 5 or 6 months of nonviolent resistance. And I believe it has been accomplished. There were a lot of things, important things that were accomplished during that phase. And because there is not much written about that, there's not much understanding about the impact of the nonviolent resistance, then it's much easier oftentimes to resort to violence by saying that nonviolent resistance hasn't really achieved anything, and it's and we can really achieve the goals that we have in front of us much quicker and much easier using violence. So oftentimes it's not that civil resistance hasn't been used, but if it was used, the achievements haven't been appreciated. Oftentimes they have been those achievements have been disregarded and misunderstood. Another denial of civil resistance is connected with the issue of legitimacy. Civil resistance is seen as unpatriotic. It's compared to pacifism, and in that sense is viewed as a too conciliatory action. Kenneth Waltz was writing in his famous book referring to civil resistance as a pacifism, as a disguised form of surrender. It is also not seen as courageous. It's exercised or used by a weaker part of population. Usually, this would be related to women. But we know that actually civil resistance takes much more courage, because one has to face oftentimes brutal oppression without arms, which is courageous by itself. And finally, there is a lot of emphasis and in that way legitimacy given to resolving conflict rather than waging conflict, to providing a certain resolution to a conflict. And so for example, if we refer to Václav Havel's writing, who was talking about the necessity to disturb peace rather than to build peace, he thought that first of all, one has to disturb the peace that is dead or unjust before one can really resolve the conflict. And certainly that kind of argument might not have gone very well with the developmental community that emphasize conflict resolution, mediation, rather than waging conflict. And then finally, that civil resistance is not effective. And of course it's not effective because people are not power holders. They are in fact victims, and they are an obedient cog in an authoritarian machine, and they rarely can liberate themselves on their own if they are indeed the victims, powerless victims. And also civil resistance, particularly against very brutal regimes, it's doomed to failure. Civil resistance would, for example, the argument goes, would not work against Hitler. However, from the book by Jacques Semelin, a French scholar, titled Unarmed Against Hitler, we know of many examples of civil resistance, many cases, episodes when the civil resistance was used against Nazi occupiers, and in the cases when it was used, it was very effective. And perhaps the argument should be made that the civil resistance hasn't been used on a wider scale to be noticeable and effective overall. And whereas in those cases where it was used on a smaller and local scale, it was very effective. And also we don't see much planning visible in the in civil resistance. Oftentimes there is not media present in the workshops, in the trainings, in the seminars conducted about civil resistance. We oftentimes see, of course, much more preparation for military invasions and military struggle. And the conclusion is that civil resistance cannot be effective if we don't see so much preparation going on the part of activists. And oftentimes, particularly after, for example, Orange Revolution in Ukraine, or after right now during that turbulent transition in Egypt, the argument goes that nonviolent resistance really doesn't produce more peaceful society, because oftentimes we see those turbulences after nonviolent revolution, after successful nonviolent revolution, that doesn't really show us that there is a straightforward line towards democratization. However, there are studies done on the likelihood of civil resistance bringing about democratic society, and in fact this likelihood is 5 times higher for successful nonviolent resistance than for successful violent struggle to bring about more democratic system. And finally, oftentimes civil resistance would rely on small acts, symbolic acts, cultural acts, acts that wouldn't be considered spectacular or dramatic, and in that sense they wouldn't be seen as powerful. But just to illustrate this issue, the argument about the importance or the power of small acts, this comes from my chapter included in the book on nonviolent resistance in Poland during the second half of the 19th century. And this is a famous story of civil disobedience against the German law that discriminated Poles in terms of the ability to purchase land and build permanent constructions on that land. In essence, Poles were on the territory that was controlled by Germany that time. Poles couldn't build permanent houses, or they couldn't build houses on the land. And in 1904, a Polish peasant, Michał Grzymała, who received a land from his German landlord, he wanted to build the house for himself, but German authorities refused to allow him to build any residence there. And in order to circumvent that law, Grzymała decided to turn a caravan wagon, and that's the picture of that caravan wagon, into his home. And because the German law considered any construction that stayed in one place for more than one day a permanent residence, and thus unlawful to be owned and inhabited by a Pole, Grzymała was moving his wagon a couple of centimeters each day and claimed that this is his portable residence. And in that sense, this portable residence was not covered by the existing German law about permanent residence. So that's why he could live in that caravan. So then, of course, the legal battle started, and it lasted for more than 4 years. And eventually, Grzymała sold the land, but the whole affair became widely known in the partition Poland and abroad. It was covered by the British and French and US newspapers that were making mockery the German institutionalized and legalized land discrimination against Poles. So through that small act of resistance, it had a really very powerful reverberations in the Polish society. Now there were a number of strategies that were undertaken by different communities and nations that are described in that book to resist non-violently foreign domination. Sometimes they were done through direct and visible actions like strikes, boycotts, and different types of non-cooperation, and that's what I would define as a kind of taking a fight directly to the opponent. However, a number of the chapters emphasize that oftentimes people were engaged in the acts of defiance, engaged in the acts of resistance through indirect and more subtle form of resistance by building and developing autonomous organizations. Oftentimes people would understand their community, their society as some kind of social organism. And that organism needed nourishment, needed strengthening before it was able to take directly on the occupiers. And oftentimes this type of nourishment was coming through the development of alternative organizations in the socio-economic field, the kind of the mutual help organizations, educational institutions. Oftentimes they were illegal or semi-legal, and they faced prosecution and legal actions on the part of the foreign authorities. A lot of cultural type of organizing with music, arts, theater, and a number of proto-political organizing that took place under the foreign occupation. Oftentimes, like it happened in Zambia, first of all, Zambians established at the beginning of the 20th century so-called welfare associations that were focusing on the socio-economic development of the black communities. But they were the foundations for the emergence of nascent political parties and political organizations during the colonial period that eventually pushed for the Zambian independence later on. In a number of places in the investigated cases, there was because the people were relying on the non-violent forms of resistance that oftentimes met with brutal oppression or certain prosecution, legal prosecution, that oftentimes backfired on the domestic authorities that were controlled by foreign powers or on the colonial authorities, and the movements were oftentimes able to win greater domestic sympathy and greater international recognition. I wanted to briefly refer to the concept that is touched upon in the book, which refers to the way civil resistance is conducted in the struggles for independence, that involves actors that are outside the immediate battlefield. This is a bit different, I think, than in the context of civil resistance against dictatorships. So we've got the kind of standard graph of the civil resistance in the kind of domestic battlefield. Oftentimes civil resistors would be engaged in building those alternative type of institutions, underground or semi-legal or sometimes legal, and then engaging in different direct civil resistance actions to push the pillars of the support of the colonial authority to yield. But at the same time, there is another kind of a second level of civil resistance engagement, which is the authority of the kind of what I called Imperial Authority that supports the colonial authority. And oftentimes particularly in the cases of the more recent struggles that are included in the book, Kosovo, West Papua, and examples from recent nonviolent actions by Palestinians. The population that is engaged in civil resistance would try to reach to the population of the dominant state through different strategies, in order then to pressure or to convince that population to put pressure on their own authorities directly or through the different pillars of support. And then another actor on the outside of the immediate battlefield is the international community, and also civil resistance population can devise different strategies to reach to that international community that can provide support, perhaps in the form of material support or moral support. Oftentimes, the international community would consider certain sanctions and would also pressure the home state to change its policies. And if the civil resistance is successful, that home state would then pressure their own colonial authority to change their policies and liberalize or withdraw. So that's the kind of two-level battlefield in the context of civil resistance in liberation struggles that we investigated in our edited volume. And finally, a concept that I think might account perhaps for the growth in the number of civil resistance struggles around the world is the diffusion of ideas. And it's interesting to see the extent to which in the chapters that we investigated there was actually a diffusion of ideas across borders as well as across time. And in the context of nonviolent resistance in Hungary that took place in 1850s, Gandhi was actually very much aware of that nonviolent resistance, and he used the lessons from that nonviolent resistance to devise his own strategies for challenging the British in India. Arthur Griffith, the Irish nationalist, he was also reading quite a lot about nonviolent resistance in Hungary, trying to see how this might be applicable for the Irish nationalist struggle. The Russian 1905 revolution inspired nonviolent resistance in Poland during that time. It gave inspirations for the Iranians as well as for Gandhi himself. And the chapters that describe campaigns of nonviolent resistance against the British in Ghana and Zambia, they made direct link to the ideas and inspirations that Ghanaians and Zambians received by reading, by discussing Gandhi and his nonviolent resistance in India. In the Polish case, the inspiration for example, for the solidarity movement in the 70s and 80s in the struggles against communism came from the readings of the Polish history and nonviolent resistance that took place in the second half of the 19th century in their own country. So it's not so much that they learned about ideas coming from abroad, but they learned from their own progenitors about their own nonviolent resistance struggles, and then they discussed the applicability to the current circumstances and how they could use different methods of nonviolent resistance in the times. And of course, we know other examples that are not investigated in that book. It's more about the struggles against dictatorships, the inspirations of Serbian nonviolent resistance for Georgians or Ukrainians, and of course the recent Arab Spring countries. Another example from the recent demonstrations in Russia that started in 2011 in December, that one could see a number of references during those demonstrations to Václav Havel, or on the Facebook, from the Facebook to Gandhi, and the use of defiance against oppression and the use of nonviolent resistance to challenge the authorities that rigged elections in December 2011 in Russia. The final slide is about the impact of civil resistance. Essentially, the book emphasized that one of the important impacts of the collective nonviolent organizing was on people's consciousness. Those nonviolent organizing oftentimes happened around language, around culture, that reinforce people's identities, that reinforce their belonging to certain communities, much more than it was previously the case. Oftentimes civil resistance was very much built around alternative institution organizing, building socio-economic, cultural and political institutions during the resistance phase, and those institutions played then a very important role in sustaining, I think, independence of a number of those countries. And finally, in a number of cases, civil resistance contributed directly to winning independence or quickening the pace of the liberation. That happened in Ghana, in Zambia, that also happened in Egypt. Interestingly enough, in 1919, between 1919 and 1921, Egyptians were engaged in an amazing number of nonviolent resistance methods, challenging the British authority, also congregating on the symbolic places in Cairo in the same way they did during the revolution against Mubarak. There were strong coalitions among different groups, including Christians and Muslims, and eventually this kind of nonviolent revolt, that time in 1921, won Egypt formal independence in 1922. That independence was limited, mainly in the foreign policy sphere, but nevertheless was there, was de jure, and was won because of the Egyptian nonviolent organizing that time. So I apologize for this longer presentation, but I hope that it gave you some food for thought, and I would be glad to engage with you and listen to your comments and questions.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Maciej, for your presentation. So as I mentioned before, now we have a little bit of time for some questions and answers. We already have quite a few that people have typed in. Please remember that you can also click the raise hand button, and I can call on you if you have a microphone or telephone ready to do so. So while people get their questions ready, I thought I'd ask one thing that came to me during the presentation, which was sort of near the first third of the presentation, when you mentioned that victims are essentially dormant power holders that have the potential to become their own liberators. And this, I think, is a very important point. So, Maciej, I was hoping you could share potentially how you think this process of transformation in the minds of people can go from this mentality of being a victim to the mentality of being a self-liberator, and maybe pick one or two examples from the case studies in the book that might have stood out to you.
Yeah. I think I would need to support myself with the ideas from Václav Havel in order to answer your question, because of course it's not an easy answer in terms of how that exactly cognitive liberation or cognitive process occurs. And according to Václav Havel, in each of us, no matter there is the seeds of dignity, and no matter how much one feels humiliated, no matter how much we are deprived of our rights, of our freedoms, we can always feel a sense of humiliation because of that seeds of dignity that we have in each of us. And the feeling of humiliation, this is the cornerstone of later resistance or defiance, because if we feel humiliated, we are more likely to reject the system that makes us feel humiliated. And this is the kind of according to Václav Havel, this is the rebellion on a kind of very individual, personal level. The cases in the book, they don't go into analysis of this individual change in particular people. They are really more focused on the more kind of collective type of psychological liberation, and this collective type oftentimes would revolve around protection of your own traditions, of your own language, of your own culture that were jeopardized and oftentimes threatened, endangered by the foreign authorities. There were a number of processes of deculturalization, denationalization against West Papuans, against Poles in the 19th century, against Algerians by the French, against Egyptians by the British, and that oftentimes was the basis for the revolt, to protect your identity and what you had before the colonizers came and what the colonizers wanted to take from you. So it's a much more kind of collective level rather than individual, personal level that those analyses are trying to understand this kind of transition from the victims to the liberators. Now, it was not enough to kind of reject the policies of the foreign occupiers, this denationalization policies. The next step was then the question how to organize and whether to lead struggle through violence or nonviolent actions. And oftentimes that diffusion of ideas about nonviolent resistance helped, and particularly that's visible in the chapters on Ghana and Zambia. The people were learning from Gandhi and Indian liberation struggle against the British, and since those countries, Zambia and Ghana, were under British colonial rule, they thought that that successful Indian nonviolent resistance might be also applicable to them. So the next stage was how to organize. We are ready to resist. We shared common grievances, and we've got common cause. We reject violence because we think that will not really lead to the emergence of a stable political system, even if we win, and where we are taking the inspiration for organization of our resistance. And they would oftentimes look at what happened elsewhere.
All right. Next, we have a question from Barbara, who asks, why didn't the American colonialists, and I suppose in general many of these struggles, not recognize their effectiveness at the time? And how do you think that we can ensure that movements declare or identify their victories when or while it's happening?
Yes, well, I think there was not much discussed and written about as the author of the chapter on American nonviolent independence struggle rights. Essentially, there was not much education through different types of media that were available at that time: pamphlets, drawings, mouth-to-mouth stories done. And I think that's the equivalent of that is as I talked during the presentation, is Syria. It's not really much written, discussed in media by policy pundits, by the Syrians themselves, analyzing what has been achieved during those 5-6 months of nonviolent resistance. So I think and then how to ensure that that achievements are really identified during the resistance struggle. I think this points to the need for the establishment of what some would refer to as movement media, essentially movements that are able to record their actions, are much more likely than to defend their position that nonviolent resistance works, look at what we did and look at its impact. And that requires capturing the actions, capturing organizing, and capturing studies about that impact, which oftentimes would require to have the kind of movement journalists or citizen journalists who are so-called embedded in the movements, writing about this and informing the public and informing the activists and informing the outside parties about the achievements as well as failures, and drawing lessons from those failures of what the movement is doing and what it could be doing better in order to, I think, decrease the risk of emergence of a violent flank during the struggle.
Next up, we have a question from Michael. This was actually the first question that was asked. How important is decentralized organization for the leadership and execution of a nonviolent struggle? And in addition to alternative or parallel social and economic institutions, do you think the resistance movement itself should be organized democratically?
Yes, I think that it really depends on the context. I remember the discussion among the Solidarity leaders, particularly after the introduction of the martial law, which was in 1982, which within a couple of weeks around 3,000 political leaders and activists were arrested. How we should organize our movement right now under this kind of more brutal oppression than before, and they talked about whether they should build underground government, and they actually rejected that idea precisely because they thought that this would be too centralized structures, that it shouldn't function as a government, that it could be, what they eventually agreed on was to build underground society, which would be much more diffused, much more working autonomously on different levels. And I think that on one hand, having a leadership which would be representative of some kind of centralization of the movement is important, particularly when the opportunities for negotiations would emerge. And then there is an issue of who will represent the movement. And if by that time there is not clear structures of leadership, this actually weakens the movement position vis-a-vis its adversary in negotiations. But the leadership might not necessarily eventually mean that the leadership is deciding and macromanaging about different aspects of nonviolent actions or campaigns that are taking place on the ground. The most important thing in terms of leadership is to set up, devise certain general strategies and goals that the movement wants to achieve, and leave up to the lower ranks through their creativity and innovation of how they want to, via the use of different nonviolent actions, how they want to promote the cause and bring and mobilize people around the general ideas that the movement agrees on, which is determined largely by the leadership. Jake, could you remind me the second part of the question?
The second part was just whether I think you already addressed it, whether they should be organized democratically.
Right. So again, in the discussion among Polish activists in the beginning of the 80s, there was one of the arguments for the rejection of the underground government was that the structures, if they are built underground or above the ground, more kind of legal, they should be open. And would allow the participation of all people, and they should be connected with ordinary people and the life and the everyday life. Now, I think that that connection between the movement and then ordinary life or daily life of millions of citizens cannot be achieved without the degree of democratization, which in that context would mean the openness of the movement and its structures and its campaigns and its actions, so everyone can participate. So it's not that decisions that are made about whether we would remain violent or non-violent would need to be democratically voted and decided, but rather the issue of participation in non-violent actions or devising non-violent actions. This could be done in an open, democratic manner. So I would think that it brings more benefits than costs for the movement to be more open and democratic.
Next question is kind of two people have asked this one. It's from Sam and Margaret, and they were wondering, despite the fact that there's probably a lot more nonviolent movements in the past that could be researched and written about, there seems to be a general trend that the amount of nonviolent struggles in the last 100 years, 200 years has drastically increased. And why do you think this number has increased?
Right, and we talk about, I showed the slide that only referred to the struggles against dictatorship and against occupation or for self-determination, but there are hundreds of, if not thousands of other types of civil resistance struggles for civil rights, for labor rights, environmental issues, against corruption. So I think all in all, regardless of the type of issues or the type of resistance, we see the increase in the use of nonviolent actions. And I think that one of the major elements is that people do see that nonviolent actions work. And oftentimes they would recognize that in terms of the available alternatives, whether using the existing political system, using existing political parties, interest groups, courts, the political representatives in parliaments, that this, for example, this road to the traditional political influence is oftentimes shut down, particularly in the authoritarian countries, and it's not really working, and people cannot use that road to make any political change. Then the alternative, the remaining alternative could be violence and either terrorist violence or just civil war, and that doesn't seem to be appealing to many people, particularly if the goal is to build a peaceful society. And another possibilities is a third-party intervention, but we don't have really many good examples of outside interventions that brought about less violent and more peaceful communities and societies. So then the remaining alternative is nonviolent organizing and collective nonviolent organizing. So that's probably one major factor that I think is accounting for this increase. Another one is which is associated with the knowledge that we have about how civil resistance works, and that knowledge is distributed via books. Our center is International Center on Nonviolent Conflict is distributing documentaries that have been translated in 30 or so languages, articles. Actually, I was surprised by, and this is just in academia, in the recent meeting of the International Studies Association in San Francisco, there was around 30 or so papers that were written on civil resistance, written on nonviolent actions, inspired by Arab Spring, as well as by the research by my colleagues Erika Chenoweth and Maria Stefan. But 2 years ago, the same meeting of International Studies Associations had a really handful papers on civil resistance and delivered by a very narrow group of people that look at nonviolent resistance before the Arab Spring happened. So there is a burgeoning literature on the subject, both in academia and outside, in the media, and greater understanding of the impact of civil resistance, of how it works, and I think that those factors are accounting for the rise in the use of nonviolent resistance.
Next up, we have a question from Alexandra, who asks, nonviolent struggle as a force of transition is one thing, but what happens after the transition, and how do you make sure that this positive energy of the nonviolent movement can contribute to the future creation of a stable political and assuming democratic system?
Yes. Some writers are saying that the movement has to do two struggles why it's engaged in resistance. The first struggle is to bring down immediate oppression that is causing so much misery, and another struggle is to build a more just and equal and democratic society after that struggle, after the first struggle has been accomplished. So and yes, it's oftentimes, I think unjustly so, people are criticizing anti-apartheid movement, kind of acknowledging the contribution to bringing down apartheid regime in South Africa, but then not being able to use this kind of force that they generated, that nonviolent force, to transform society in South Africa, so the structural violence would be reduced or eliminated, and there would be greater equality than people see right now. And certainly there is, I think, a lot of possibilities still for the improvement within the movements on how they prepare themselves for the transition. So oftentimes the activists are engaged in the heat, in the immediate heat of the battle, and they think only about how they survive and how next day they can engage in actions that will cost a regime and would put pressure, more effective pressure on the regime. They focus on the kind of short-term gains and objectives, and they don't really focus on how the movement can, what should do and how it should prepare itself when the breakthrough occurs and transition starts. And I think that we know that during transitions there is a need for expertise in the very technical reforms, establishing civilian control over the army, introducing economic reforms, introducing decentralization reforms, introducing judicial reforms, then working on the constitution and adopting new constitution. All of them are very, most often than not, in previous transitions they were experts and kind of top-down approach to organizing that transition, and there was not much input from the movements because movements were not able to offer anything tangible. And I think there is a need to think about the campaigns and think about the type of maybe expert even structures, expert groups that the movement can build while it's resisting oppression, that those expert groups can then set up even the agenda for those very technical reforms. In Egypt, during the current ongoing transition, there were a number of campaigns in order to hold military accountable, in order, let's say, the campaign no to military trials, or to ensure a smoother kind of transition to civilian control over the military. And those campaigns were led by the movements and grassroots organizing. We don't find many of those examples in other transitions in Latin America or in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think that the question for the movement is how to prepare themselves for the not only for the immediate struggle but also for that transition. And if one of the possibilities would be to organize an equivalent of the shadow civic government within the movement, where different people, with different professional interests and expertise, could actually start working on the blueprints for specific reforms that could be then advanced via different types of campaigns and different types of civil resistance methods once the transition starts and once the movement needs to make its positions known on various issues. Another, and I will end here, another perhaps thinking should be on how the movement, if eventually the goal of the movement is oftentimes it's not always, but oftentimes it's to become a driver of political change and to be in the driver's seat after the breakthrough occurs, which means that the movement will face with turning itself from the civic movement into political organization, into political party. And the question is, what is the difference between a movement and political party, and how the activists can become politicians, and what kind of training, what kind of knowledge they need to be exposed to in order to be not only effective organizers and activists, but effective policymakers if they decide to join the government. And that was the case with the Solidarity movement, where a number of Solidarity leaders, when the Solidarity in 1989 in essence became a political organization leading a political campaign. And that kind of knowledge might not be well, I think, understood and present among the activists, particularly if those activists are thinking about becoming eventual policymakers in the future.
All right. I think with that we are pretty much out of time. Maciej, were there any other final closing remarks or comments you'd like to make?
I would just like to encourage again people to look at the book website. There are a number of ideas and concepts that I haven't been able even to touch upon, and then of course if there is an opportunity to get hold on the book, you can also contact me at the email that is on display, and feel free to send me your questions or comments, and I will try to respond. Follow us, ICNC, on Twitter and Facebook. You can also follow up. We can also follow the book posts as well. And please stay tuned. In the future, we plan a number of webinars. So I hope you'll be interested as well in joining us.
Great. And as Maciej mentioned, there's a number of different ways you can keep in touch with us. Let me pull up our final closing slide. And again, you can send questions to Maciej. You can also send them to us at webinar@nonviolent-conflict.org. This webinar has been recorded, so we'll post it to our website shortly. You can actually also download our iPhone People Power app by following that link right there. It's free to download. We also have a twice-weekly news digest that we publish, which will announce news. Actually, a lot of the case studies mentioned, or a lot of the countries mentioned in the book, are frequently featured in that news digest. And we have an online academic e-classroom using Moodle, which you can sign up for, which also has many of the case studies mentioned in the book, as well as much more information. It's very useful for educators and students. And that should be it. Maciej, thanks so much for your presentation.
Thank you, Jake.